Good evening, Mr. Evans here. We have a new book tonight, and if you've been listening to any of my other stories, you've noticed that the books that I've been choosing have been stories that have been published, a fairly long time ago. I'm trying to choose some stories or some books that maybe kids of today have not seen or heard. Because there are a lot of good stories out there, and not all the good stories have to be just recent. The book that I have tonight is called Dollar for Luck, and it's by Elizabeth Coatsworth. And this book was published first in 1951. Everyone knew her patched sails and burdened shrouds and the faded paint of the eagle at her bow. "There's the store boat," Mr. Philbrook called in at the kitchen door to Mrs. Philbrook, who was washing the breakfast dishes. She looked out of the window and smiled. "I'm almost out of thread," she exclaimed. "Think I'll leave the plates to drain and get right down to the wharf." "You'd best," said Mr. Philbrook, "but thread will only be the beginning." He took a thin wallet out of the pocket of his vest he wore over his shirt and counted out 3 rumpled dollar bills and handed them to his wife. "Half a mind to go with you, but I've a pile of work waiting for me down at the shop." She was already untying her apron and patting her hair smooth at the little mirror beside the back door. "I'd like to change my dress, but I haven't time. Maybe the boys would want to go with me." She was already half up the path to the street and never lost a step as she shouted, "Ralph, Stuart, Kenneth." A shout answered her from the door of the boat shop down by the water, and the 2 big boys appeared on the threshold, their natural blondness added to by a sprinkling of sawdust. "Store boat's in," shouted Mrs. Philbrook as she started down the road. "Want to come?" "Too busy now," Ralph shouted back. "Have a good time, Ma." "Where's Ken?" This was over her shoulder. "Probably down at the wharf ahead of you," Mr. Philbrook called after her. But by this time Ella Small had appeared from the next house, and the 2 women were hurrying down the road side by side, talking as they went, while Mrs. Timothy Bent and elderly Mr. Young came racing down their separate walks, the screen doors banging behind them. Half the village of Friendship was waiting for the old schooner, as she edged in between 2 fishing boats to make fast at the wharf. There was a man aboard and a woman, wearing a short skirt over a pair of breeches and rubber boots, and a dark little girl at the wheel, bringing the vessel in as slick as a gull catching a fish head. Everyone knew Cliff and Belle Trask, but the girl was new. What was her name, and where did she come from? They were sizing her up. 11 or 12, perhaps, a little too thin, but pretty if she hadn't looked so gloomy. Knew how to handle the old pluribus unum, anyhow. Most people left out the E of the E pluribus unum, which was written on the scroll coming out of the eagle's beak at the bow, just like the legend on the silver 1872 dollar for which the schooner had been named, and which was still nailed to the mast after 20 years. The old pluribus took handling, being cranky by nature, and so obscured by the brooms and pots and pans and hoes and shovels and potato baskets hauled up on her shrouds, that some people called her the sailing hat rack. Not that she always wore her gear that way, only on pleasant days when coming into port. But the banging of dishpans in the wind, and the thump of hoes or shovels against each other, and the creak of cordage and old blocks, made music for the store boat as she sailed grandly to her station. The first person aboard was Ken Philbrook, who went over the side like a yellow-haired monkey, while the schooner was still 3 feet from the wharf. Ken wasn't interested in buying. He was just mad over any and every kind of vessel. "Hello, Cliff," he called to the master. "Hello, Belle. Want me to help run out the gangplank?" They had already dropped the sails. The furling could come later. As the women poured over the side in a flood of eagerness, making for the cabin where most of the dry goods from Boston were stored, anxious to choose a dress pattern or a bonnet before the prettiest ones had been taken, Ken retreated to the wheel where the girl still stood. "What's your name?" She looked as though she wouldn't answer and then said briefly, "Emily." "Mine's Ken, Kenneth Philbrook. What's the rest of your name?" She looked away. "None of your business," she said at last. Ken didn't press the question. "My dad builds sloops over there. That's his boat shop down under the White House with the lilacs, you see, just beyond Josiah Bent's fish house further out. Dad used to go fishing, but one time he started to build him a new sloop, and she looked so good Tom Southwick came along and bought her. And before he got the next one built, Alonzo Durgan bought her, and it's been like that ever since. Dad's never had time to build one for himself." "Should think you'd be glad," the girl answered, looking towards Ken's house rather than the boat shop. "Your ma's got some pretty flowers. And don't I get tired weeding them. Wish I could weed a pretty garden like that, maybe pick a few flowers and put them in a tumbler on a table." "What a silly thing to wish, when you can live on a schooner and sail away to places everywhere and see porpoises and whales and vessels from all over the world and storms and everything." "I hate drifting around all the time on this old hulk. I want to go someplace and stay put and look out of my window every morning and see the same thing." "Why don't you then?" "Why don't you go to sea?" "Emily," shouted Mrs. Trask in a voice capable of being heard in a gale, let alone above the clatter of the shoppers. "Emily, you go catch them shag kittens. Mrs. Decker here thinks she might like one." The girl left the protection of the wheel and disappeared toward the bow, bringing back with her a box from which 4 or 5 heads of dandelion yellow, with short kitten ears, were popping up, while soft paws clawed at the edges and had to be pushed back. Mrs. Decker wasted no time. "I'll take that double-pawed one for the white nose, but I won't pay more than a quarter for any cat or kitten under heaven." Mrs. Trask didn't argue the point. "You'll have to put it in your shopping basket," she said. "My paper bags are giving out. I got that lot of kittens over at Boothbay. Party I got 'em from said the old cat was a fine ratter." Elderly Mr. Young stood watching the kittens for a while, and then took out a quarter and gave it to Emily, and picked up the smallest kitten and put it into his pocket. "Why, Mr. Young, what do you want another cat for?" Ken asked. "You got 5 now. 5 anyhow, and maybe more." Elderly Mr. Young just winked at the children. "Just had a fancy for a foreign cat. Know all the ways of the ones around Friendship. Come on, Barley, you and me'd better go home." And he made his way through the women and up the gangplank. "He's real nice," Ken explained. "He lets us take as many apples from his trees as we've a mind to." Emily was twirling a straw for the remaining kittens and said in a softened voice, "I liked him." But there was no getting away from Belle Trask's demands. "Here, you, Emily, put them kittens away. I want you should run up the rigging and get that clothes basket for Mrs. Thompson." "That's too high for you," Ken began, but Emily interrupted him. "Wish I had a penny for every time I've climbed clear up to the topsail. You take the kittens back. There's a crate top to put over 'em." "Emily!" shouted Mrs. Trask. Without answering, Emily climbed up into the rigging, detached the clothes basket, which looked almost as large as she was, and composedly climbed down again to give it to Mrs. Trask. "While you're at it, bring down that second shovel, Emily," called Cliff Trask from where he was talking with one of the Simmons boys. "And hurry, Emily," shouted Mrs. Trask. "I want you should go down in the cabin. They're clamoring for attention in there." Ken didn't see the new girl for some time, as he wasn't interested in cabins, but was interested in everything else about a vessel. He looked the old pluribus over from stem to stern, shaking his head over the condition of the Eagle at the bowsprit, coiling a line now and then as he came across one that needed coiling. Cliff Trask was a good seaman, but the women came board so fast it didn't give him time to get the deck ship shape when he first tied up at the wharf. He'd have her all ratted up before he left in a few days, but meanwhile Ken lent a hand. It was funny. Nothing on board ship seemed like work, but everything ashore did, even working around the shop with Dad and the boys. Ken would get so mad thinking how he'd never sail on the sloop they were building that he'd sneak away from the boat shop every chance he could get to go fishing on the Peapod. Someone had to fish. When Dad scolded, Ma'd say, "At least Ken don't waste his time. There's 2 or 3 nice pollock in the ice house, not counting what's in the skillet for your dinner." And that would kind of take the edge off of Dad's annoyance. Ralph and Stuart used to try to reason with him, telling him there was twice the money in boat building there was in going to sea, but they gave it up. It was like talking to a cod. Ken just looked at nothing and set his jaw, and they knew he wasn't listening. Made Ralph kind of mad, but Stuart was easygoing. "I tell you what, Ken, Ralph and me'll build you a sloop of your own when you're 21, he promised. But 8 years is a terribly long time to wait when a boy is crazy to go to sea. Chapter 2. Mrs. Philbrick was full of talk of the store boat that noon, who had been there and what everyone had bought. And there was a little girl, Otis, they got from the Portland Orphan Asylum. Did you notice, Ken? She had 1 blue eye and 1 hazel eye. She was pretty just the same, but not happy looking. If I didn't know Cliff and Belle Trask so well, I'd say they weren't treating her right." Ken looked up from his plate of corned beef, onions, carrots, potatoes, and cabbage. "She's silly," he said. "Doesn't like going to sea, that's all." "There's lots of people feel the same way," Mrs. Philbrick ruminated. "I've got a cousin on Gott's Island, never been off the island. Husband can't persuade her to try it." "Just give me the chance," said Ken to his plate. He had given up saying it to his family. "Well, Nabby, what did you buy with your $3? Mr. Philbrick asked, when the pie and cake had been cleared off the table. Mrs. Philbrick had been waiting for the question. "It's all over there on the sideboard. 6 spools of thread, new knitting needles, a dipper, and a fresh wash bowl for the back porch bench. The old one looks bad, it's so chipped, and a saucepan in place of the one that got left on the stove last winter." "Looks like you got your money's worth. Wasn't there anything you wanted for yourself?" Mrs. Philbrick smiled and patted down her apron. "Yes, Otis, she said gently. "There was quite a little more it seemed to me we needed. I got a nice pattern of white organdy for a summer church-going dress, and a chip hat to match, and some cotton to make you and the boys' shirts out of, and buttons, and 6 sheets and pillowcases, and I guess that's about all." "Phew, Ma, that's a lot all at once. Guess you'll have to go into your egg money." Stuart winked at Ralph, who winked back. They had heard this conversation every year for as far back as they could remember, and knew just how it would end. But Ken, who hadn't lived so long, listened rather anxiously. He had 47 cents of his own, if that would help Ma out. But Mrs. Philbrick was as smiling as ever. "Why, Otis, you know the egg money's for specials. These things have got to be got. I guess nobody's going to say that Otis Philbrick's wife puts patched sheets on her line, and you certainly don't want to be ashamed of me when we go to church. Your pink dress looks nice so far as I can see." "Well, men don't see far. Everyone's seen that old pink dress till they're sick and tired of it." Mr. Philbrick might have said more, but Stuart pushed back his chair, followed by Ralph. Guess we'll be getting along, Dad. Want to finish putting in that decking today if we can. Mr. Philbrook surrendered. How much will it come to, Nabby? $17.45. The little girl's going to bring up the things this afternoon. $17 will do. I'll take out the rest out of the egg money. No one was surprised when Mr. Philbrook carefully counted out $20. Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, he said, giving Mrs. Philbrook a little pat on the shoulder. Like as not, Belle's got something more you've set your heart on. For once, Ken tagged his father down the path worn between the house and the boat shop on the shore. The gulls were flying back and forth overhead, silently, as white as angels and as graceful. The green-black spruces darkened the land, below which the bay, circled close by islands, sparkled with every ruffling of the water. Dad, Ken said, but his father didn't hear. He was watching the gulls as he often did, as he would watch a fish or a porpoise for that matter, studying the creature's beautiful, strong shape, wondering how he could learn from it, so that the next sloop he built would be lighter and swifter in the water than the last. Other people were well satisfied with the vessels he built, but Mr. Philbrook tugged at his pale mustache and was never satisfied. For the sloop must be safe as well as fast. For he did not forget that men were to sail her, and that on his head lay the responsibility for his neighbors' lives. Dad, Ken repeated, pulling at his father's old coat. Mr. Philbrook looked down. What can I do for you, son? Lend me some white paint, Dad? Do you mean lend or give? Ken grinned. Give me some white paint, Dad? How much? Enough to paint the eagle on the pluribus. Do you think Cliff will let you? Guess he will. It needs paint all right. Last time I saw it, the old bird looked like he was molting. You can have half a can. By this time they had reached the shadows of the half-open shed, where Ralph and Stuart were outlined dark on the bright water beyond. Hey, yelled Ralph sharply. That's my best brush, Ken. Take one of those in the corner. When I get the white on, I'll need blue for the ribbon and red for the stripes on the shield. I heard you. And a little yellow for his beak and claws, Dad. And a little green for the leaves. Guess we can spare that much for the American eagle. But you won't need much, Ken. There's no use wasting good paint. Hunt up some old cans, and we'll pour a little in, and you'd better take a couple more of the small brushes. But wash them out when you're through, and bring them back. Ken hurried off between the first goldenrod and the last daisies. Wish he'd show as much interest in the sloops, Stuart said from the upper shadows, where he was sitting on his heels, laying deck slowly and carefully. He would if they were afloat, Mr. Philbrook answered, taking up his tools. Sometimes I think we'll have to let him go, but I don't like to worry Ma. Nothing worries Ma, Ralph said, halfway up the ladder. I'm afraid this would. No more was said on the subject, as the three were soon lost in their work. Ken heard the tap-tap of hammers and the squeal of a saw as he reached the road, but the sounds were as familiar to him as the mewing scream of the gulls, and he never thought about them. He carried the clumsy clam basket carefully, with its load of old tin cans into which the paints had been poured. He was absorbed in a vision of the eagle of the E pluribus unum, bright and proud once more, and nearly ran into the girl Emily, who was coming up the road with her arms filled with heavy packages. Ma was right. She did have one blue eye and one brown eye. Hello, Ken, she said, cheerfully for her. I was hoping I'd meet you. Up here all the houses look alike. Which is yours? I've got a lot of things for your ma. Ken turned around and pointed at his house. Up there under the eaves, it has one of those big wooden cobwebby things. Ours has a star on it. Bent's has a kind of sunflower, and Small's has fans. You can tell by that if you don't remember the shapes. Of course, they're all white. Emily stared at the houses. I never noticed how fancy they are, she said admiringly. That doily thing up there dresses them up a lot. And some have the wooden lacework all along the edges of the roofs. But I like yours best. A star is nice. I'm going down to the storeboat and see if I can't paint up that old eagle. Wouldn't you like that? I don't know as I care. Suppose it would look better. I hope the Trasks will let me. They'll let you. Your ma bought a lot of things. I'd better be getting on or I'll drop them. Bye, Emily. Bye, Ken. Clifford Trask was perfectly willing to let Ken have a try at the eagle. He watched him a little while to make sure he was careful with his paint, and then wandered back to his customers. People were still coming aboard the E Pluribus Unum, but by now there was more gossiping and less buying. No one came near Ken. All the long afternoon he worked, whistling to himself in short, sharp breaths, shrill and tuneless, utterly absorbed in the slow transformation taking place under his hands. At first he was not quite sure of himself, and several times had to swab off a blob of paint, which had appeared in the wrong place. But as he gained in confidence, there were no more accidents. The lean head, the spread wings, and the strong legs of the bird stood out now from the faded bow of the schooner. And with mounting excitement, Ken saw the fresh green laurel leaves, the shield, and the lettering appear. It was very late in the afternoon before he had finished, and Belle Trask walked up to admire his handiwork. That does brighten her up a whole lot, she said. Cliff and I are obliged to you. It's good for trade, and then, well, it just looks nice. We get too busy to notice. Maybe this fall when we lay up at Swan's Island, we can have her all painted. Thanks a lot. That's all right, said Ken bashfully. I like doing it. You're the Philbrook boy, aren't you? I remember you other years. Wish that Emily would take an interest like you do, she sighed. That reminds me, she isn't back yet. You tell her if you see her to come right along. She's not supposed to take a half a day when she goes on an errand. Now that the customers had all gone home, the remaining kittens had run of the deck, and were scampering about wildly, chasing one another, bouncing up in the air, their soft fur ruffled to make them look twice their size, rushing out of hiding places to clutch one another in pretended fury, which sometimes became so nearly real that two kittens would roll together into the scuppers and then dash apart, their little tails straight up in the air. A pleasant smell of baked beans came from the cabin, and the small ripples slapped gently against the schooner's sides. All the shadows were very long. The whole village lay in shadow, with the roofs and trees like ornaments against a golden sky. But the islands were bright with late sunshine, and the seagulls, floating in the upper air, were rosy pink, not white at all. Ken felt an almost unbearable heaviness of heart as he walked slowly away from the storeboat. He kicked sadly at the stones in the path. Earth meant nothing to him, so strong and deep in him was the love of the sea. He turned back to look at the eagle he had painted, and the great bird seemed almost ready to fly away to some other harbor, some small inlet in an island, or tucked away along the shore of a point, places which Ken had never seen and perhaps would never see. When he got home, he found Emily still in the kitchen with his mother, who looked up with an air of preoccupied pleasure. Been teaching Emily how to make my gingerbread, she explained. She's real quick at catching on. Emily looked like another girl, so happy and eager. May I give Ken a piece, ma'am? She asked. It's the first I ever made. Ken had a moment's qualm about delivering Belle Trask's message. He knew that as soon as he mentioned the storeboat, she'd change back into the old Emily. But if he didn't, she might get into trouble. He took a bite of gingerbread. "That's good," he said. "Real good, Emily. You'd better take some back for the Trasks if Ma doesn't mind. Belle said to tell you you were wanted." The light faded out of Emily's two-colored eyes, and the smile drained from her lips. "Oh, dear," she exclaimed anxiously. "They'll be put out. Here I've gone and forgotten again. I can't keep track of time once I get ashore." "Thank you, Mrs. Philbrook, for everything. I've never had such a happy afternoon." And she hurried toward the door. "Wait a minute," called Mrs. Philbrook. "Ken, you find a paper bag folded up on the second pantry shelf. I want you to take the gingerbread, Emily, and come back if you can. I don't know when I've had such a pleasant afternoon either." And cutting the gingerbread free from the pan with an expert hand, she put it neatly into the paper bag which Ken had brought, and as she handed it to Emily, she leaned down and kissed her. The girl flung her arms about her and began to cry. Then she pulled herself free and said, almost desperately, "I'd better get going now, if I'm going to go," and ran out, slamming the screen door behind her. "She isn't very polite," said Ken, "and that gingerbread will be all crumbs." His mother didn't answer. She was standing, the knife still in her hand, looking out of the window after Emily. Then she shook her head, sighed, and turned back to the business of getting supper. That is the end of our reading for tonight. I will see you tomorrow evening. We'll start with Chapter 3.